the Graveyard book was one of our campus read books, which is open to everybody, not just on campus, but to the general community as well. So you said that you had an idea for the Graveyard book at the age of 25, and you tried to write it, and you realized it wasn't going in the direction that you wanted it to. So I'm curious if you could explain a little bit about that, and how did you find it?
So, the Graveyard book, I was 25 or 26. I had a 2-year-old son, 18-month, 2-year-old, somewhere like that, who loved tricycling. And we had, at that point, we were living in a very tall, thin, spindly house above a shop. And every room was on a different floor. And the problem with having a small boy on a tricycle was it would have meant death to allow him to tricycle in the house. So every day I would walk him over the road to the little graveyard on the other side of the road, and he would ride his little tricycle around. And I just remember looking at him one day and going, he looks really comfortable here. I should do a story about a kid who gets brought up in a graveyard by dead people. It'd be like the Jungle Book, only instead of animals, I'd have dead people. And it seemed a brilliant idea, and I went straight up to my office, and I sat down, and I basically wrote about half of a first chapter. And I looked at what I wrote, and I went, okay, this is the idea that I've got is a better idea than I am a writer. I'm not good enough for this, and I need to get better in order to write it. And it wasn't, there was no question in my mind. I'd written and published a handful of short stories at that point. I'd written and published a lot of journalism. And I knew that I had a way to go as a writer. And I knew that the idea was better than I was. And so every 5 or 6 years, I'd try writing the first chapter again, and I'd stop fairly quickly and go, no, this is better than I am. And then round about 2004, I went, I don't think I'm getting any better anymore. So it doesn't really matter now if I'm not good enough. I'm about as good as I'm going to be. So I may as well write it. And even then, I started it, except I had a brilliant idea. I thought, I think I'm going to start in the middle, because I've started at a version of chapter 1 so many times now. I'll start a story in the middle and find out what these characters are like when they're all sort of capable of walking around. And I was on a vacation with my 2 daughters, and I don't do vacations. This was the first vacation that I had taken in years and years and years. And so I'm sitting on a beach going, I don't really know what you do on beaches, so I pulled out my notebook and I wrote the first 2 pages of this chapter, The Witch's Headstone. And my daughter Maddie came past doing sensible things like swimming, and she said, what are you doing? And I said, well, I'm writing a story. She said, read it to me. So I read it to her. And I just got to the point of convincing myself I needed to give up. And she said, oh my God, this is great. What happens next? So then I had to keep writing so that she found out.
So did you know what the story was going to be? Or were you just, and this actually leads to just a bigger question about your process when developing a story, but did you know what it was going to be?
I knew that, yeah, I did, because it was all contained in that very, very first idea. Because the very first idea had been, it's called The Graveyard Book, it's going to be like the Jungle Book. And that like the Jungle Book gave me the idea that this was going to be a conversation with Kipling, that I was going to look at the Jungle Book, and that I was going to be free to reimagine, to converse, to use the Jungle Book as a wall that I could bounce a ball off, kind of thing. So I knew the shape of it. I knew it had to end with him leaving the graveyard, for example. And I got to play with ideas. So I would take the bandalog of Kipling, these wild monkeys, and turn them into my ghouls. I would take a story called The King's Ankus and turn it upside down and create the witch's headstone. And in each case, there isn't a one-to-one correspondence, nor is there meant to be. But there are things where I could go, I'm going to take this. Silas came out of Bagheera, in some ways, and Miss Lupescu comes out of Baloo. The Sleer bears some relationship to Kaa. It's, and when I say that, it's also not the Disney story. It is very much the Kipling thing. And but that idea that I was going to be in conversation with Kipling also created this very peculiar structure where I knew from the word go that I was going to create a novel out of short stories. But they had to be short stories because Kipling wrote 2 volumes of The Jungle Book, only half of which are Mowgli stories, and the other half of which are great stories with animals in, but they're not that thing. So I went, okay, I need this to be short stories in order for the idea of bouncing off against the Jungle Book to work. So what I'm going to do is I will do a story every 2 years of Bod's life. So I will start when he's 18 months old, and then we're just going to meet him every couple of years and see what's happening to him. And I will see if I can build an arc, a sort of a big arch arc, not a building that's meant to rescue animals from the rain.